Registrazione? Ok.
Recording in progress.
Buongiorno a tutti e siamo al quarto appuntamento con questi martedì del Bauhaus. Prima di cominciare con l'incontro di oggi è un grande piacere, un enorme piacere annunciare a tutti che siamo stati ufficialmente selezionati come partner della fase di design dell'evento New European Bauhaus, quindi lo Iuav a partire dai prossimi giorni sarà ufficialmente all'interno della pagina dell'Unione Europea e i nostri eventi saranno anche diffusi tramite la pagina e rientreranno in un calderone di eventi che, se avete occasione, vi invito ad andare a vedere sulla pagina ufficiale, perché è veramente molto ampio e mostra anche come la discussione che stiamo cercando di portare avanti qui a Venezia, intesa come centro della discussione, ma vedete che i nostri ospiti vengono anche da molto lontano, è in realtà solo un piccolo frammento di una discussione molto più ampia che si sta portando avanti in tutto il continente e che cerca, un po' come stiamo facendo noi, di definire un pezzettino alla volta, una tessera del mosaico alla volta, tutta una serie di caratteri per questo grande progetto di ripensamento dello spazio fisico, che chiaramente parte dall'Europa, ma forse anzi sicuramente non si deve e non si può fermare all'Europa stessa, ma si allarga invece a una dimensione globale. Quindi lascio la parola a Mattia per l'introduzione ed è un grande piacere avere con noi Ed Blakely.
Grazie Jacopo, passo all'inglese. Thank you Ed for being here. Idro Blakely, former director of planning school in Berkeley, University of California, person in charge for the recovery after Katrina hurricane in New Orleans, in the leading of the post 9/11 in New York, and director and advisor for really a lot of time in all around the world post-disaster recovery and community engagement experience, is here for helping us in understanding in which way we can work on repositioning to help reducing the risk reduction and to help cities, overall European cities, in dealing with climate change and the global issues that we are facing today. Thank you very much for being here. Also Ed is a really close friend of Iuav institutions and is invited professor from some years in our courses of urban planning, regional planning, and post-disaster recovery. Thank you so much for being here, Ed.
Grazie. I'm very happy to be here. I wish I could be there in person. You forgot to mention that I've done much work in Italy and post-disaster planning, and familiar with the country and familiar with very much of Europe, particularly those places that have suffered disasters like Turkey. I think the first quote here is very important. It is not possible at this stage to build safe buildings if you do not have a safe community to put them in. In a disaster, the tendency is always to rebuild. And you might be rebuilding the disaster. And that's what my lecture is about. And it's going to be in three parts. What it is you're rebuilding for and why you're rebuilding. The second will be the tools and techniques that you'll use in the rebuilding. And the final will be the implementation of the rebuilding process. My lecture has changed a good deal, at least in focus and direction, because of the pandemic. The pandemic is clear evidence that we will have disasters over and over and over and over again. So we must prepare our communities to deal with disasters and don't hope that the disaster will not come, because it will. The combination of climate change, the release of many various elements in the environment mean that contagions of various types will take place. So let's think about what we have to do in a disaster. And one side of this picture, you see the buildings falling down. The other side, you see people have hoarded the food and taken the food off the shelves. So the disaster is two things. It's the destruction, comes externally, and the internal disorganization and social disrest and unrest, because people are afraid, and their fear brings about a different kind of disaster. A disaster of communication, a disaster of social change, and a disaster of belief. And we see that with COVID. People will not take the vaccination because they don't believe in it. Even they know that the disaster of shops being closed because of this COVID is there, they still are not able to cope with what they have to do to remove themselves from this problem. So we have disasters on every front. We have floods, we have earthquakes, we have numerous natural disasters, but now we have environmental disasters, as you can see here. And our job is not to deal with the current disaster. I want to re-emphasize that. We are not dealing with the current situation. We are not trying to get back to the past. We're trying to build a different and better future. And that's what you see me doing with my team in New Orleans, focusing on the future. New Orleans has a very rich past. All of Europe, every city has a very rich past, particularly Italy. The past is celebrated very much. But the past that the Romans built was not the past for the Romans. They were building for the future. The great roads the Romans built were for the future, and they're still there because they thought of the future. The great aqueducts and water systems that the Romans built are still there because they built for the future. The tunnels and bridges and things that were built for a future, and when the future came, we're ready for it. And after the war, people had to rebuild their countries facing the future. So I think we ought to think of this as a war. The pandemic is a war, and we must recover from this war by rebuilding in a different way. I call this repositioning. Reposition, moving to another place and doing it intentionally. So the climate has changed. We have earthquakes everywhere. Just last week in China, in the beginning of summer, people froze to death in a race where normally the weather would be mild. They froze to death and were dehydrated because the weather had changed that quickly. So we're going to have fires, floods, and earthquakes around the world, particularly fires, because as the climate is changing, it's drying up much of the world. California has had 3 fires in 1 year. Last year, we had a fire that was so vicious here in Australia that it's burned out areas that will never revegetate. We will never have vegetation on them. The fire was so hot, so dangerous, so bad. But these fires, these floods were caused by us. We had very improper, in California and the United States, uses of our natural environment. And the floods were caused by the fact that we drew too much water. We crippled the landscape. When the fire came, we had nothing to stop it. Australia, the same. We damaged the land so much that it was not resilient to fire. The Aboriginal people had small fires and built so they could resist fire. We build so we hope that fire doesn't come. And when it does come, we're surprised. So the older people, the Romans, the Aboriginals, all of them knew disasters would come, and they built their dwellings, they built their places for them. We have to take those lessons into consideration. Heat, of course, is the biggest one now. And this heat is causing a human migration, which is another disaster. People are moving around the world from Africa to Europe, creating another human tide of disaster. In Syria, I heard this week, people do not have enough food. So we have a tremendous disaster in Latin America, people coming toward the United States because they don't have enough food anymore to sustain themselves. Oops. And the other disasters we're having are really man-made. That is terrorism, 9/11, other places in the world. Terrorism is a direct result of people being destructive because they feel they are not being treated justly. So, as Mattia and everyone has heard, I say there are no natural disasters. The disasters we experience are a result of how we build places, how we occupy them, how we structure our governments to deal with them. Almost every government in the world is able to deal with the present, but not able to deal with the future. There are no future planning departments or people who are looking out 50, 60 years. They're only replicating what's happening now and making it bigger. So in Australia, with this pandemic, we should have learned a good lesson. We're building bigger and bigger cities, but we discovered that the small cities didn't have disaster of the pandemic. Had we built across this big continent a lot of smaller cities like New Zealand has, we would have been better off. So it is not the natural environment that's causing the disasters. It's our psychological brain environment that's causing the disasters. So where to start? Please, those of you who are administrators, those of you who are politicians, those of you who are leaders, do not say to the people, we will rebuild. Maybe I should say that in Italian. Someone say it in Italian. We are going to reposition. Rebuilding is dangerous. Here you see most of the city of New Orleans underwater. Had we rebuilt New Orleans like this, it would be underwater again. So we had to build with the water, not against it. So the first thing where to start is to start with a new vision and direction as to what caused the problem. Why the hurricane, that's natural. But the reason that the city fell down is not natural. You know hurricanes are going to come every year. You even know from what direction they're going to come. If you put up big barriers and the hurricanes come from another direction, and that's what happened in New Orleans, we created a new disaster because the water could only run into the dams and flood the entire city. So you have to understand how you're rebuilding, where you're rebuilding, what you're rebuilding, and create a new future vision. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on that because the mindset most of you have who are listening to me is that the best way for me to help people is to put them back where they were in the same house, on the same street, and the same condition. Even in Italy, the law requires this. But what we should say is, where should the people be living if we have to face this disaster again or another disaster? Another issue is we fight over the rebuilding because we all have the view that if we rebuild my place first, if we rebuild that place first, we will have achieved something. What we have done is made people further divided. We see this even in this pandemic. As soon as you give out some vaccine, if you haven't got a program to give it to everybody, you just made everyone angry. So we have to reposition. This asset is not an asset right now. The middle of Venice, the Great St. Mark Square, is a dilemma. And this happens over and over and over again. And the city is being ruined by it. What do we have to do? We have to deal with the water, not the buildings. If the water is dealt with, the buildings will take care of themselves. So you have to go directly to the cause. What is it in the Adriatic? What is it in the tidal system? If we put a big barrier that tries to keep the water out, the only thing we've done once the barrier falls down is have more water in the city and more damage. How can we get the water to flow through the city and cause less damage? That is the goal. The goal is not to make a bigger and bigger and bigger system of dikes so the water won't come. The goal is to figure out how we deal with it when it does come. So it's the ecosystem before the rebuilding system. What is the ecosystem? The ecosystem, the ecological system that is there. What you see in the pictures is where the Mississippi normally flows. You would be foolish to put houses there again. But that's what I was tasked with. And instead, fortunately, people in the city said, no, we have to go in a different direction and put the houses in a better place, safer place, and build the city to deal with the problem. So don't start with the rebuilding, start with the problem. And that means we have to go with the people, not sitting in rooms, not listening to lectures like to me. You can see me here on my bicycle going around the city with the people, giving them the information about the causes of the disaster with experts. And they came to the same conclusion I did, that they had to frame the city in a different way. The same thing's true in Christ Church. Rebuilding the cathedral will not save the city. You have to frame the situation in a different way. So as the city is being rebuilt, you're building a stronger place. And those new rules, for example, in Christ Church meant there are certain places you would not build at all, ever. In other places, you'd build more securely and in a different form, even using different materials. So repositioning. At the top, this slide isn't too good. You see what New Orleans looked like when I came there. These roads were already in very bad condition. Should I put more cement so people can travel by car? Or should we make a path so the water can go through and people can move by foot? So that's repositioning. Repositioning is dealing with the natural situations, the physical situations, the future physical, even the social conditions. In New Orleans, we had a lot of problems dealing with people by class, by race, by economics. We've seen in COVID, some firms have become gigantically more rich, while the rest of us have gotten more poor. The firms that deliver pharmaceuticals, the firms that deliver goods, the firms that deliver food, those firms are hugely more profitable. But the rest of us are barely able to live. So they're making money from our misery. So how do we reposition ourselves so we share the wealth more? Social equity is one of the biggest issues in replanning and repositioning. So, as you can see me here in the gymnasium, getting ready for the new day, preparing my body, and on the other side, preparing our minds. A new demography, a new economy. And I want all of you to think about, what is the current demography? Who are the people living in your area? What work do they do now? Because that work will be disrupted. In Kobe, which was one of the leading ports in the world, after they had their disaster of a fire and an earthquake, that port was useless, but they still needed an economy. They still had people. How do you build a new economy on the base that you had before? How do you build an economy that's on older people? Because the young people left. So think about what position you're in. Much of Italy, we have a situation, when I was there, the young people were leaving the very cities, like Cassia and so on, because the damages of the earthquake meant there were fewer good jobs. So you have to start thinking about designing a new economy. You have to start thinking about getting older people healthier and more fit and thinking toward the future rather than thinking toward the past. So you need, step one is to make a 30-year time frame. All the government regulations are about 5 years. That is a very poor time frame. 30 years is the minimum time frame that you need. Because what's coming is these new outer space things. We're going to have satellites, and they're putting them up now, that will beam most of the information we need, move most of the goods we need. And the old factory with all the smoke is going away. And post-COVID, more factories will fail than ever before, all over the world, even in China. So as we go through the transformation, focus on the future of this transformation. Step two is, how do we do, like Guy said, make a safe community to put all this in, economically, socially, and politically. Politically, we need to redesign our existing governmental systems. We have to think about, and I have here in these circles, a new social system, a new environmental system, a new equity system, a new sustainable viability, a new system of cities. I'm going to stop there for a minute to see if there are any issues from what I've just said.
Okay, I have a first question, if you agree. Are you there, Ed?
Yeah.
Okay. How we can merge heritage and repositioning? In Italy, you know, we have these cities that have been built centuries after centuries, and almost everything that has more than 70 years is considered heritage here, and it's really difficult to change, transform buildings, streets, and urban form nowadays. So how do you think in general in European cities and more in the most ancient cities, I think about Italy, but also about Germany and France and Spain, how we can manage this conflict?
Two ideas. One, we have older buildings that were well built. They usually survive these disasters. Those older buildings are the very buildings you can use for new industries, like computer industry. As a matter of fact, the big industry for Italy should be education. So the older buildings can be adapted to new uses. We're going to be using a lot more electronic storage. The buildings can be there. The second is, how do we put new systems with the old? And that's what we did in New Orleans. So we knew we were going to have more music. We had to have digital music. So we were the first to go to the digital for the music. So how do you take what is there? And remember, in Kasia, we talked about using new agricultural techniques, the farmers working together to produce finished farming products rather than just sending them out. So they bake the bread rather than send away the wheat. So how do we move upscale in what we're doing, where we are? And then how do we take advantage of the new technologies? Your university is still open because of this machinery. How do we take advantage of the same machinery for other ways of interacting with people? All of us enjoy shopping in Venice, but the Venetians haven't done what the New Yorkers and other people have done. The New Yorkers and people from Chicago are selling their goods online almost as much as they did when the visitors came, are providing experiences of visitor experiences. One thing I know that in some parts of Europe, in Southern Europe, they're making motion pictures because they found in Spain and other places where the weather's good, with COVID, they could keep the people farther apart and have much of the scenery they need for the mountains and the skiing and all that. So how do you use those assets with new technologies? But that means you have to retrain your people so that they feel they're getting something out of this and they're not being bypassed. And I think one of the unfortunate things is in Italy and many countries, many people are being bypassed as you recover rather than incorporating. So let's move on. So I started on the next topic, and that's the reformation, the reforming of place. Places have to be redesigned, reorganized, so that we move less. Already, most of places like Venice are walkable. But most of the tendency now is to add more things so that's even less walkable, not more. The movement of people and places has to be much more centered, because the fuel, the energy, and the rest is dangerous to the environment and unhealthy for people. People are overweight because they're not moving enough. So you can see in these pictures here, people are eating out of doors. The same place can be later turned into another use. We already have that infrastructure in most of Italy, but we're gradually tearing it down to make a more modern infrastructure rather than making it the best place in the future. So reforming and reformatting, and I think Katja is a good example of what we've done. And you might want to discuss that with your participants of how we worked with the people in the community to build the future. We didn't impose the future on them. So, endemics are here to stay. We will have endemics. Those are pandemics, but on a smaller scale. Right now, the flu is an endemic, but the Spanish flu killed hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions. It was the flu. So there will be more COVIDs. And so in Italy, there must be people trained in pharmaceuticals. You should not have to wait for England to make your vaccine. We have to start making these things locally and start creating systems internally in our countries as to creating new forms of work. And that's my second part of my presentation. How do you turn your external orientation to an internal orientation? We had to stop thinking of music in New Orleans, the people coming to the music, but how do we get the music of New Orleans out of the city? And that's been done digitally. So now you're listening to New Orleans music when you get in a cab in Moscow or even in Italy. So how do we take our foods and other things and move them to new places using these new technologies? Now, most of you will say, what I want after the disaster, just to be left alone, to get back to where I was. You can't go back there. In the city where I grew up, Oakland, California, they had a big fire, burned down most of the city. And a famous writer was asked, what do you think of your hometown? And she says, it's not there anymore. You have to say, what if it's not there anymore? How do we build it? So how do we build for this new economy? An old church has the walls for this kind of data storage because the walls are a meter thick. It's cool in these churches already. So they're ready as a platform for the news technologies. So recreating place has to be in conjunction with recreating the people. In too many places we went in Italy, they built these little houses for people to go and sit down while somebody else rebuilt the city. In New Orleans, we got the people of the city rebuilding the city and rebuilding it in a new fashion, in new ways. So how are we going to use artificial intelligence and virtual delivery systems? These are the systems of the future. And I'm bringing them up now, and I wouldn't have if it hadn't been for the pandemic, because I've seen the destruction, the virtual destruction of so much work during the pandemic. Large warehouses where people used to package food, the packaging is now being done by robots. You'd think during the pandemic, you'd want more delivery drivers. You need fewer because robotics, artificial intelligence tells you where the food is needed quickly and better. So I'm urging people to start thinking about the future before the next disaster. The current disaster, from my point of view, is too few people thinking about tomorrow and too many thinking about the survival of today as a future, and it is not. In Australia, we have to start thinking about making smaller cities, not bigger ones. You have to think about putting in a very fast train system, because we learned in the pandemic, the best doctors were located in a very few places. And if you can't fly there, they can't get there. But the train can move things much faster and connect the cities much faster. The Chinese have built 30 or 40 fast rail systems, and that kept their economy together while ours was failing. You have good trains, but they're going to have to be faster, better, smarter. And how are we going to reform our local institutions? You talk about the old buildings. How do we put our schools into many of these old buildings rather than building new buildings? Venice has done that pretty well. The schools are in many of the old buildings, but other places haven't, and the school buildings are pretty terrible. How do we make our libraries in new ways? How do we make cooking and preparation of food in new ways and new places? These are the things we have to think about now, well before disaster. So in the first part, I said, you've got to know what kind of disasters you're going to face. And the second part, I'm saying that you have to know how you're going to reform the entire system, not just the place that was hit by the disaster. Too much money is going into restoring tourism as it was. I don't think tourism will ever be the same again. Fewer people are going to move to more secure places for more specific reasons. The tourist wandering around in the shop is probably gone for good. That's not a good thing for us, but that's what is going to happen. So the second part of this is thinking about how this future is really going to transform us. We are now giving a discussion that normally I would give in one of the big rooms we have on the campus. But this discussion can now go globally, not just locally. And the university's IP will sooner or later be on delivering information anywhere in the world. So the third thing is realigning your citizen participation. Everyone now has one of these. Can you see it? The iPhone. Okay. People can get more information delivered directly to them so they can participate in new ways. So we have to get people involved across the community and participating in building the future. And I think that's been one of our major accomplishments in New Orleans and other places, and getting people to think about how they rebuild this future and building better systems so they can debate, discuss, and help make the changes. And it doesn't matter who they are or where they are, we can bring the information to them. And that information, if we can do it face-to-face, we can do it through our information systems, we can beat the lies that are going to be turned out by vicious people by putting the truth in people's hands very early. So before I go to the next step, are there any questions? First, we find out what the problem really is. Second, we start reforming the entire system. Not just building a few buildings, but re-educating people, having them face a new future, incorporating new technologies, moving places around, making places more resistant. What do we do in New Orleans? We basically move how the water traveled through the city. You saw some portion of that. Venice is going to have to do the same thing. How's the water going to travel through the city? How's Venice going to return to what it was? Venice used to be the place where knowledge was exchanged around the world. Maybe that is the better future than tourism. You can deliver knowledge around the world from Venice easier than bringing to people to Venice to gain the knowledge. You can use the ancient techniques that they built Venice to teach people how to build better, safer cities. So you don't start the rebuilding with rebuilding the buildings that were there. You rebuild the economy that has to be there in the future. You build most of the cities, most of the provinces I visited in Italy have a government that was built in the 1960s. It is not prepared to deal with the future. We have to rebuild the whole governmental system. Retool, I call it. Secure different kinds of funding and financing for that future. And people should just say, oh, that's the government's problem. We can do things together in better ways. Housing and community facilities have to be built in better places. There are parts of New Orleans that still aren't built, but those places are harvesting ecological goods and environmental goods that are needed for the future. There are parts of Venice and other places that need to be rethought. Where they need to be rebuilt, I'm not sure. So making a clear vision for the future in a government, this is that, and building your neighborhoods so they're sustainable. Not just your whole city, but every neighborhood. And this is what the Japanese have done so well. Every one of their neighborhoods can survive by itself. If it's cut off from all communications, all food supplies, it can survive for several weeks by itself. And then we enhance our local institutions, our public institutions, make them better, stronger. We've been running away from local community development, making bigger and bigger government and making people feel more and more feeble. One of the best things we did in New Orleans is build local community groups that started rebuilding their own neighborhoods, and then they became better neighbors. Crime goes down, people become believing in themselves, and they introduce new ways of working together, producing new products, new services, and new goods. So this is our recovery plan. So we're rebuilding some locations. We're revisioning our neighborhoods. So people in those neighborhoods are part of that revisioning. And notice that corridor down the middle? That's where the water can run. That's not a street with cars on it. But when the weather's good and things, it is a much better place to live. And we have to celebrate this. We have to go all the parts of the city doing this rebuilding together as a total organization. A picture like this wouldn't have been possible in New Orleans before we had the hurricane, where people came together to cut ribbons in other people's neighborhoods. But once these neighborhoods were secure that nobody was going to take something from them, that they were all going to participate, they did much better. So I've said this, redevelop self-sufficient areas. Break your city down into pieces. Break your city down. We had 13 different neighborhood areas. Each one of them had a separate profile. Each one of them was rebuilt because the disaster hit them in different ways. And the way they did things before was to make everything the same in every neighborhood. And that was a disaster. So think about breaking your city up as we did in Kasia. There are places up on the hill, there are places down below, there are places where old fabric and new fabric, and you had to divide the city up to make a recovery plan for it. And this is a new one for me, localizing energy production. In the very near future, a combination of batteries you see on the left-hand side and wind turbine and sun will be the energy system of the future. So let's start incorporating those now so then when a big wind comes or a flood comes, we're not paralyzed and lack energy and the resources to do anything. So let's start thinking that through now and localizing our energy supply. Boulder, Colorado generates all of its own power now. But none of it is with fossil fuels. It's all with wind, with turbines, with batteries, and other things. And we have to start thinking of different ways to finance our communities. One of the things I advocated was that communities develop their own bond system. That is, a certain amount of money is put in out of the treasury every year. People do it by donation. So that when the disaster hits, they don't have to go to the big government. They have some money that they put aside over 5 or 10 years, and they can begin to manage their own affairs much more quickly. So I'm localizing capital. Like energy, I'm localizing capital. So then where we have needs, we can put them to projects and project funds. And that's what we have to do in disaster. And the last one, you've heard me talk about this, and that's in planning the strategy. The strategy has to be something that every cab driver talks about. It's not a strategy of the strategic planning office. It's not just a strategy of the mayor and the council. It has to be a strategy in which all the people say, oh, I know what we're going to do next. I know what my role is, how I participate. So this is my last part. So before I go to it, any issues?
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. Just a quick question. I see that the idea is very impactful on the public areas and on the open areas. In the reconstruction, often it seems that the, let's say, housing part and the private parts are with a logic that is very much similar to the pre-destruction one. Do you think that because that can be a problem in terms of, can we imagine new settlement models, new types of construction, and how perhaps can the public body give a direction even to private companies to construct also the private part in a different way, because that is much impactful in a city.
Yes, I think here we have an example in Kasia where we had a bunch of apartment buildings that if they were rebuilt, they would be cause a problem of the future. So we had to restructure where they were located, how they were located, and how they participated with other parts of the neighborhood. So we have to help people rethink of how their housing is going to be rebuilt. And that means the government has to participate in a different way. It can't say we're giving money to rebuild it as it was. It gives the money to rebuild it in the future and in a future way. And again, if people have saved some money to begin with, they can participate in that. Their local banks, their local savings and institutions. You don't want to think about it, but every one of us is going to have some bad thing happen. And that's why we have a health insurance. That's our insurance for their house. Government has to think the same way. How do we start preparing people for a disaster, for a bad thing? So you do have to rethink it. Much of the housing that's been built, I would say, from the late 60s in most of Italy, and I've seen it, will not survive any kind of disaster. It was very poorly built. You have to start rebuilding that housing now. In every city we went, the old parts stood up to the earthquake and the new parts fell down. That should tell us something immediately. So we should start, and there are places very close to Venice where we have to start rebuilding the city, and there's talk about moving different businesses together into one cluster rather than all of them struggling to recover. Move them to a central cluster and then build a better, safer building out of that. There are places, particularly in the medium-sized and smaller parts of Italy, and I don't know the other countries as well, where the shops are shut, have been closed for many years. Let's start revitalizing those places by moving them closer, making safer. And in New Orleans, we had to put some of these things on the second level so that when the flood came, we could sacrifice the first level. But that meant people had to come together and build this new structure on top of the old one and cut away some parts of the buildings. So we have to start doing that, implanting the idea that we're going to move forward in a new way. So remaking places. Here are several places that have been remade, and they're facing a different future. You see here a COVID classroom, not the students sitting in rows anymore. You see here a business down on the bottom. In this business shop, they sell flowers, they sell coffee, they sell all these things in one shop. We still have a coffee shop and a flower shop and the like. So, and then in the middle, they're gonna knock that whole building down to make a green space for the city. So when the floods come in some place, the water will have some place to move and not run down the street. And what you see is the example of what it's going to look like in the future, so people can envision that. So we have to remake places. And lastly, we have to take control with powerful communications. That means we have to be on Zoom. We have to be on internet. We have to, I think every city ought to have an online YouTube channel where people get the local news. It may be of the local football and sports commentaries and all kinds of things, but they have to get used to truth-telling coming from the lowest level. Because when you get to the higher levels of government, they want to try to tell only so much truth. But if people are facing a situation, they have to have truth from the lowest level. So I think local radio, local television, we have the capacity to do that with online television right now. we have to keep the press involved with the policies and the actions as we do it. That is a very big job. And I found that was the most important one, because the only way to keep the lies out is to keep the press close to you, or they will make up stories. I agree with Trump on that. The press will make up stories. And with him, he made up stories too. But get the people participating. Here you see the people participating in designing the areas of recovery. Part of the governance process. That's how you implant the strategy. And lastly, I want to say this. Build tomorrow or nothing at all. Don't build to the past. People are going to live and work close to home in the future. Maybe not in the same place. Biohealth, as you see in the center, is going to be very important. We can have a situation in the future where people are afraid of vaccines. They should learn about them while they're in school. They shouldn't be afraid of new movement systems. We're going to have very small scale movement systems designed to move people short distances in the very near future, using rubberized rails and the like. Long distance travel, because of disease and other things, will be minimized. But don't forget who we're doing this for. We're doing it for these little guys. That's why we're thinking 30 years ahead. It's for them, not for us. So I hope this has been useful,
Totally.
Informative. We have 3 minutes left.
Well, just to say thank you. Thank you very much. Has really been a pleasure, and as always, really helpful for orienting our work on this new European Bauhaus. And we hope to see you as soon as possible in Italy. Well, it depends not on you, but on your government, we know, because for people that doesn't know, it's impossible to move out from Australia right now. And I pass it to Italian, and then we will have some minutes for saying hello. La settimana prossima, per chi ci segue in diretta, non ci sarà la nostra presentazione, perché lo spazio è giustamente dedicato al confronto tra i candidati rettori, se non sbaglio, giusto Jacopo? Mi confermi? E per cui ci rivedremo tra 2 settimane con gli incontri del European Bauhaus. E grazie mille Jacopo, and thank you Ed, and see you the sooner as possible.
Grazie.
Thank you.